Thank you, Steve, for those very two kind words, probably. It's very daunting for me to be here in front of such I think, probably a group of real China experts. It's also an honour for me. But I might say that one thing I've learned since moving to the States this year, which is the first time I've lived here, that modesty in any form is a capital crime. And that the honour of speaking here today maybe is not as big an honour as I got earlier this year when Donald Trump listed his top 20 books on China, and mine was at the top, ahead of Henry Kissinger's. But I got an email from a friend later, and he said that was simply because Mr. Trump admired my comb-over. In talking about the Chinese Communist Party, you know, there's always a lot of confusion about whether China is communist or not. And that's why there's lots of jokes about the Communist Party. You know, some people describe it as the world's biggest mixed business. You can describe it as the world's biggest chamber of commerce. The head of one of the largest U.S. private equity groups was speaking in London recently. I won't name him, and he said that he finally understood how the Politburo worked when he realised it was just like Goldman Sachs. In other words, there were about 30 people, mostly men, who had access to all the information and of course were on every side of every deal. Apologies for anybody from Goldman's in the audience. China also fits the old Russian joke about communism. I don't know whether any of you remember that, and that is that communism is the longest path from capitalism to capitalism. Anyway, so back to the initial question, is China communist? I think a much smarter way to look at it is a description which I think comes from the Chinese ambassador to London, not to me incidentally. And he said China has a communist government, but it is not a communist country. And there's a duality in there, I think, that rings true. I mean, if you look at how China is governed, and has been governed for centuries or, you know, thousands of years, there's obviously a deep bureaucratic tradition of strong rule by the centre, and all manner of things that go with that. You know, emperors putting spies into various units of the armies out in the provinces alike, so to ensure that the armies remain loyal to them. You know, appointing people to positions according to a stated moral code, so-called. The party clearly didn't arrive in China like some kind of alien spaceship. The Leninist system is a very nice fit for the Chinese system with deep bureaucratic roots. Ruling behind the screen has a long tradition in China. That's why you'll get many people saying, well, the Communist Party is just another dynasty, you know, the latest sort of inheritors of this ancient, you know, hydraulic civilization, which is so-called because of the need for a central government to manage agriculture and irrigation and the like. And I think there's probably some truth in that. But of course you don't want to carry that too far, because, you know, Chinese history is replete with, you know, every dynasty collapses. So, you know, you only want to go so far with that. Henry Kissinger sort of has a go at describing the enduring traditions of Chinese statecraft in the first third of his book, but he really doesn't meld that with the structure of the modern day party. In a more up-to-date fashion, the modern Chinese government has lots of sort of McKinsey-like add-ons. You know, every official above a certain level has these numerous KPIs, key performance indicators, which they're meant to match. So in that respect, you know, it's kind of like McKinsey-Leninism rather than market-Leninism. And that is a very kind of, you know, vital part of the government system as well, and I'll come back to that. But what was really striking for me once I kind of set upon this idea to write about the structure of the party and how it worked, was how traditionally the party is still structured along, Soviet hardware, or if you like, Leninist hardware. Now, what is a Leninist system? We've all had to have a re-education about that. It's basically a very secretive party, a purely political organisation which controls the government. It sits on top of the government and the law, and is basically a law unto itself. In that respect, the party is a self-governing and self-regulating elite. And if you listen, of course, to China's top leaders, not sort of scurrilous foreign journalists like me, it's also far too often, for its own good these days, a self-enriching elite as well. What precisely does the Communist Party control in China today? Well, obviously much, much less than it used to. Anybody with any experience in modern-day China knows that individual economic freedom, or even individual freedom for Chinese, has increased exponentially in the last 30 years. You can live where you want, you can buy a house, you can have a big BMW, you can travel overseas whenever you want, you can get rich, send your kids overseas for school or to a private school and the like, marry where you want, marry when you want and whom you want and the like. There's obviously still some major restrictions, most notably the one-child policy. I don't seek to diminish that policy, but even that is being eased in some areas, and I think it's never really been a one-child policy for everybody in any case. But throughout what really has been a remarkable liberalisation in sections of the economy and in the individual lives of Chinese, the party has made sure to keep control of what I call in my book the 3 Ps, which is personnel, propaganda, and the PLA. 3 parts of the system which sort of sit there like kryptonite, which you can't touch. So let's start with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. As you know, that is not the country's army, it is not the nation's army, it is the party's army, which is the reason if you read Chinese military newspapers, it's unlike in the States or in the UK or in Australia where I come from, where there's often a debate about whether the military is being politicised. If you look at the military papers in China, there's a raging debate about to ensure that the military is not depoliticised, just the opposite. If you look at propaganda, the propaganda department, which is a party department, which is separate from the government, all media comes under the propaganda department. Now, obviously, the media in China these days has become far more vital and vigorous than it ever has been. That's for a number of reasons. That's the commercialisation of the media, combined with the internet, combined with journalists who are more professional and effectively want to be journalists as they see people behaving in the West. Controlled these days by the propaganda department. It's much smarter than it used to be. It's much more macro than micro. In other words, they understand the need to allow people to vent on certain issues and the benefits they gain from that. It can almost get out of control. I'm sure many of you followed with interest the recent train crash in Wenzhou, where there was something like 36 million messages posted on the Sina Weibo website, followed a week later by the Beijing party secretary, I think, paying a visit to Sina to warn them about fake news. But there are a number of taboos with the media, though, that still exist, and that is you do not attack top leaders or their family members by name, and you do not call into question core policies on Tibet, Xinjiang, at the moment Falun Gong, and of course on the party rule itself. The third area which I enjoyed writing in my book is personnel, which I think has been little understood outside of China, and that of course is the central organisation department which manages what the Soviets used to call the nomenklatura. At the risk of repeating something from my book, I tried to illustrate this by conjuring up an imaginary central organisation department as if it existed in the US. And if you had a similar body in the states. It would oversee the appointment of the entire cabinet, state governors, the mayors of every major city, the heads of all minority political organisations, regulators, the chief executives of ExxonMobil, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Walmart, in other words, the 50 biggest companies, the justices on the Supreme Court, the editors of every major paper from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, the bosses of all the cable networks ranging from Fox to MSNBC, and start to see why a politician would like such a system. On top of that, the party oversees the choice of the heads of, say, in the US context, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford universities, and it also chooses the heads of the top think tanks. For example, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which has lots of terrific people doing a lot of good work, but the head of the CAS is chosen through the organisation department, which is why many old-timers in CAS still refer to their body not as a think tank, but as a department. Now, not only that, the vetting for all these jobs takes place behind closed doors in secret. Appointments are announced without any sort of accompanying explanation as to the qualities of the person who gets that job. The small details were really telling for me. It's a way to illustrate a much bigger thing. The organisation department in Beijing, which I'm sure you've all driven past many times, does not have a sign outside saying what goes on, what happens in this fabulous building inside, and it does not have a listed phone number. It has one phone number, the last time I checked, and that is a phone number where you can leave a recorded message complaining about the quality of a particular cadre's work. That's the organisation department. Now, finally, to cap out the internal system, if you're a top official and you're in trouble for corruption, the party catches and kills its own. You are investigated not by the police, but by the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, which is also a party body. Which is why you only realise when a corruption case comes to a head when the individual is expelled from the party. The role of the courts is basically for sentencing, a public sentencing, if you like. They don't have a role in the actual investigation. And that fits with a central tenet of party rule, which is that there should be no independent centres of power outside the party, which makes it very difficult to develop a fully functioning legal system. I like to remind people that the present Chief Justice in China does not have a law degree. Now that is not an entirely fair comparison because the Supreme Court in China is not the same as the Supreme Court in the US and other countries. The previous occupant of that job was, by Chinese standards, an activist legal reformer, but still, it's a telling fact nonetheless. The sheer size of everything in China always stuns. There are about 80 million party members now, which I think is about 1 in 12 adult Chinese. That is also about on par with the old Soviet Union and its satellites, which had a sort of similar ratio of membership. It's less clear how active all those members are, of course. I used to have a favourite figure about 5 years ago when there were 76 million party members. And at that stage there were also 76 million stock trading accounts in China. But many of those stock trading accounts, of course, were in fake names or doubling up or whatever. So maybe that made the comparison even more apt. In any case, that is the control side of the equation. But if China was just about the party's control, then it wouldn't be the success story that it is today.
You're going to lose your head, aren't you?
Behind you. Where's that coming from?
Yeah, I don't know.
Anybody press a button? Lean against something?
Sort of James Bond-like. Anyway.
The party is here. You've said it in the book.
I certainly hope not.
Bullseye on that.
Yeah. But anyway, so going back, that is the control side of the equation. But if that's that's not all it is. China, the party is a political machine, but China is not sort of one giant Tammany Hall, one big, smoke-filled room, as it were. There's a lot of smoke-filled rooms in China, as we all know, but it's if the party had simply been obsessed with control, the political control I talked about earlier, then it would have collapsed, I think, a long time ago. And the reason it hasn't is that I think that its obsessions run equally in the opposite direction as well, which is basically creating a strong economy and attempting in a limited way to adapt the governance of party officials to the much more complex realities of the Chinese economy today. And they've done that in the 90s by making a start in reforming the state sector. Many people will tell you that it's kind of stopped these days, but at the very least huge things were done in the 90s. In the early part of this, the noughties, about 50 to 60 million people were laid off from central level SOEs. That's equivalent to the workforce of Italy and France. It's no small thing. All political machines suffer from the atrophy that comes with cronyism and corruption. But I think the party has attempted to stall that cancer, if you like, by balancing the cronyism with the sort of KPIs that I talked about earlier. Now, you read a lot of stories, I think I've even read them in my own paper, about how China is really being run for the benefit of 100 families, powerful revolutionary families. I personally think that is a little overstated. China is a funny mixture of meritocracy and aristocracy, and the two have seemed to survive in tandem with each other without gobbling each other up. But if you look at the leadership, the current leadership, for example, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they come from nothing. That won't be the case with the next leadership. But I also think it's a bit silly to just dismiss Xi Jinping, for example, as a princeling, because clearly he is a competent official at the same time. The party has also adapted its membership along the way. It's no longer the party of farmers and workers. I interviewed lots of students at places like Tsinghua and Beida, for example, and the party will actually go into those classes at what are already highly elite institutions and identify, what they would regard as the top 2 people in the classes and invite them to join the party, and that also happens at some high schools as well. So it's a funny thing that this party has got 80 million members, but they still style themselves as an elite, which means you have to be invited to join. You can't just sort of knock on the door and invite yourself in. Entrepreneurs are welcomed, whereas they were once scorned. If you look at the rich list, I think about a third, maybe more, of the 100 billionaires, and there are real billionaires in China on the latest rich list, were party members. So basically the party is getting rich and successful people to join, alongside of all the government officials for whom it's basically in a way pre-qualifying for a position. Now, my job these days actually is reporting US politics, and part of reporting US politics whether on the Republican side is I've been looking at this will sound tangential, at the Mormon Church, LDS, for example. But it occurred to me when I was reading about the history of the Mormon Church, Mao used to have this philosophy of continuing revolution, which was a complete disaster for China. The party is a bit like the Mormon Church in a series of continuing revelations. All these sorts of things that used to be taboo in the church, in the party, private business, entrepreneurs, wealth inequality, foreign investment in banks and oil companies and the like, stock trading, so they sort of wake up one morning and have an epiphany and declare it legal. That's the only point of comparison I have with the party and the Mormon Church, but I can have a funny story about them, which I can tell you later if you want. Now let me just sort of finish up with a few general comments. You can make the point that the Communist Party runs China. I think a lot of people have forgotten about that, but and I've attempted to provide a corrective to that. But if the Communist Party runs China, well, on one level, so what? It's no easy thing to run a country of 1.3 billion people and keep the country stable and growing. This is not the 50s, the era of Reds under the beds anymore, and the Communist Party is not what it was in the 50s, 60s and 70s in China. There's a lot of talk about the so-called Beijing Consensus as opposed to the Washington Consensus, this sort of binary division, which is, based on the assumption that the Chinese system is exportable. I don't think it is exportable. As far as I can see, a lot of the Beijing Consensus, it just seems to apply to any authoritarian country whose rulers want to stay in power and get rich. They think they can be like China, or they can't be. Let me illustrate that. Could you ever imagine, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo having an organisation department? No, you couldn't, because it does not have the same bureaucratic roots and traditions that China has. The only country that vaguely resembles China, I think, is Vietnam. But even Vietnam struggles to do what China has done. I think Vietnam, the last time I looked, reminds me a little of China in the early 90s. In other words, growing quickly but with the high inflation. No Zhurongji figure on the horizon yet to smash it on the head. But for all China's pragmatism, be it tactical or strategic or whatever at the moment, I still think that political differences between the US as the world's most important and powerful democracy and China are very important and will play out in ways, I think, that are really unpredictable in coming years. Let me try and illustrate that. Chinese political system, for all the wish fulfillment in the West that it would become more like us over time naturally, remains vastly different, and they are determined to keep that so. That is why the media in China constantly denigrates the West and democracies, in other words, an alternative system. In that respect, I think the Chinese system is hostile to the West, not in a military sense, but hostile to the idea of Western dominance and Western-style democratic values, however besmirched they might have become in the West in the last 10 years. The structure of the Chinese economies also remains, for all the reform, vastly different. The state still, you hear these sort of figures. Some people will tell you the private sector is responsible for 70% of output in China. Somebody else will say 30%. You're not going to get an exact figure because the issue is a definitional problem. But even leaving that aside, the state still dominates or even monopolizes the following sectors in China: telco service providers, not equipment, I might say; banking, oil and energy, petrochemicals, heavy industry generally, mining, aviation, ports, construction, and about 70% of the auto market in conjunction in JVs with foreign companies. I think it's vastly underestimated the importance of the US to China's rise. Not just access to the US market, which is important, but I think the Pax Americana, if you like, in other words, the forward deployment of US troops into Asia. China's rise has been predicated on a peaceful international environment. China did not make the same mistake as the Soviet Union in attempting to take on the US militarily. A very smart decision. It also obviously had a staged reform of its economy and gave priority to economic reform over political reform. I read a review of Ezra Vogel's book on Deng Xiaoping. I quite haven't picked up the book yet because it's too heavy to read, but there was a terrific quote in there about Deng's attitude to Soviet reforms, and he simply said, "Deng thinks Gorbachev is an idiot." I thought that kind of summed it up. But it's underappreciated the extent to which China has benefited from the US military umbrella. So let me illustrate that in a crude fashion. If you look at North Asia, the Korean Civil War is not over. The Chinese Civil War is not over. Sino-Japanese tensions continue apace in different ways every day of the week. The only thing that has kept these tensions in check, or the most important thing that has kept these tensions in check and provided the stability that has allowed for the fantastic growth in wealth in North Asia and also Southeast Asia, is the stability provided by the US military. Now, that can't last. Why should China, which is a great power, want to rely on the US for its security in North Asia if it can do it itself? It wouldn't want to do that out of a sense of national pride. It wouldn't want to do that out of a sense of prudent security policy. It should take responsibility itself, for example, for bringing its own oil through the Malacca Straits, if you like. How the US and China adjust to each other's presence in the Pacific, I think over the next 10 to 20 years, is going to be fundamental to not just security in Asia, but stability, I think, in the global economy. It's not just about China fitting in with the US, it's also whether the US can cede power to China. And I think the big open question, and certainly one I haven't come to a set view in my own head, is about how the Chinese political system would manage that. Remember that the first peg of legitimacy for the Communist Party has been economic growth. Sooner or later that will tail off, be it in 2020 or whatever. You can't grow 10% a year forever. The second leg of legitimacy is obviously nationalism and the fact the party has made China great again. How does that play out once the US and China have to work out a modus vivendi in the Pacific, over Taiwan, over how the whole of Asia is run? And I think that's the big question that I'm looking forward to following in the next 10 years. So on that note...
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't go over the closing with him, but that obviously is a commercial for the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and exactly the kinds of issues that we talk about on a daily basis and the programs that we run with an attempt to have China and the United States understand what each other's intentions and goals are and find a way to deal with China's peaceful development. And that's exactly the kinds of issues we'll be talking about next Monday and with Foreign Minister Yang on Thursday. So let me ask a few questions. Did you prefer to stand or sit? Either is fine.
I'll stand.
Stand. Let me just say, I'll start off with a few questions, very few, because we're already at the halfway mark, and then open it to the floor, because I know a bunch of people have questions.
I might say that I haven't, it's 2 years, I've been back to China quite a lot, but I haven't lived there for 2 years, and I felt out of touch with China even when I lived in China, so, I'm not really up to date on the economy.
How'd your book sell in Hong Kong and Taiwan? I assume it was translated into Chinese, and I assume it's banned in China. How did it sell in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and what have you heard from your Chinese friends and sources about the response to what is a book that I think takes the cover off certain things that the party would prefer not having the cover off of?
Well, I think it's just been. I think there's a Chinese language edition out in Taiwan right now. One thing I've learned as an author, you find out very little about how your book sells because publishers never tell you, unless you're Dan Brown or something like that, a best-selling author. So I don't know how it's gone in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I might say that the shop that has sold the single most copies is the Bookworm in Beijing, which I'm sure many of you have been to. It's not banned in China technically because nobody ever presented it for publication.
So the English language copy is sold in China?
Well, in the Bookworm, sub rosa, under the counter type thing. That's just a little enclave.
This is on the record and goes out over the internet.
Yeah, I think they've got bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
But a couple of people did tell me that the Central Liaison Office, which deals with the section of the party that deals with foreign barbarians, did do a report on the book for internal purposes, and they concluded that the book was superficial, journalistic, contained errors. So maybe so far so good, maybe. But most importantly, from their perspective, did not disclose internal decision-making procedures. In other words, I didn't crack, what's happening at the top of the Politburo, and in fact, I never attempted to pretend I did. It's all of us have been through Hong Kong Airport, where you've got those lots of Chinese language books with lurid pictures of Chinese leaders and multiple mistresses on the cover and all that sort of stuff, and you don't know how much is fact or fiction. And I didn't really attempt to do that sort of thing because I don't know what is happening at the top, and I frankly think very few people do. Perhaps even in the U.S. government do. It's a black box, the Politburo. And so in that respect, my lack of ability to penetrate the top echelons of the Chinese leadership might explain how I can still get visas back to China.
Mm-hmm. You made
rewarded for failure.
Yeah. Well, you made reference to throughout the book. You talk about corruption. I mean, it's a recurrent theme. And you also talk about something which we see a lot in dealing with the senior levels of the Chinese government, which is Chinese officials that really know their portfolio. That I cannot think of a Chinese official at the vice minister or above level, or the vice governor or above level, or mayor of a major city, who really just does not know his portfolio very well. And what I'm often trying to square that with is what your book in part talks about, which is some positions are for sale, or there is such corruption that is endemic to the position. So how do you kind of square the two? Is corruption just a pay to play, but you got to be qualified anyhow? How does it really work in practice?
Well, the crude pay to play, as you call it here, I think it is mostly at lower levels of government. There was a case, I think, about 2-3 years ago where there was a suggestion, never officially confirmed, that the Shenzhen mayor had bought his job. He was removed for corruption, but there was a suggestion that he'd actually bought the position, and that is a really senior and important job. Are people who are vice ministers in various ministries buying their positions? I've never seen any evidence of that. It's this balancing, I guess, of trying to, the system understands that if the system is only about cronyism and corruption, then they're going to eat themselves alive. Which is why I think one of the successes of China is that there is a performance culture in there, combined with the bureaucratic DNA, if you like. You don't get too many non-performers in top jobs. Having said that, everybody is across their portfolio, but remember, a lot of that is, they can, the fabulous memories which are, I guess, trained from rote learning at school, to the fact that any official who doesn't want to lose their job has to know by heart what the official policy is and be able to recite it, which is also part of the performance measurement as well, not putting a foot wrong. But I think it's true that we should. You can be corrupt and competent at the same time as well.
There's a great description in the book, long description of exactly what you referred to in the talk, that there's not enough understanding of this organization department in the West, that we really don't get it. And you talk a lot, in fact, about publicly listed companies where the organization department is appointing the chairman, which is inconsistent with Delaware law that you owe your duty to the shareholders, not to some unknown party, which is the organization department. But recently, and the book kind of ends just as Li Yuanchao is taking, who's becoming the minister in charge of the organization department. He is an unusual Chinese official. I mean, you talk about him actually in the context of the pollution issue in Taihu Lake, I believe. But he also is somebody who spent time at the Kennedy School, who talks about a transparent government, and we have begun to see some changes in the organization department that you're looking at. Do you see this as kind of it becoming a more transparent organization, becoming an organization that actually publishes its criteria for promotion and makes this more transparent? Is this one person, who I assume is going to be named to the standing committee of the Politburo in 2012, able to change this process?
Well, I think I think the party has known for some years that it has to be a little bit more open and transparent, but it really struggles to do that because it doesn't know how. You're right about Minister Li. He is, I've met him a few times. He's very chatty. He's not a stiff personality. He does engage with you on various issues. And I think they know that. He's certainly wheeled out to meet a lot of foreign visitors of all kinds. All kinds. The organisation department, I guess recently in the last few months they've had a whole bunch of foreign ambassadors in and given them all these documents about the history of the organisation department and how it works and the like. They have published some of the criteria, which kind of fill a small book, which really makes you wonder whether they're really used in practice or are effective. When they put a sign up outside their office and get a phone number and start to explain the nature of their decisions, then I think that's real transparency, not simply publishing a sort of bunch of their sort of rather stiff, rigid formula for appointments. So they're trying to be more open, but I think the whole ethos is heavily resistant to that, and it's a struggle for them.
Let me open the floor to questions. Are there microphones, or people just need to speak loudly? Anybody? Microphones? Okay.
You? You? Down the back?
On the McKinsey phenomenon that you mentioned.
Speak real loudly, Frank.
Yeah, Frank Kale, USCX. I spoke not too long ago with a medical anthropologist who is often invited to China to talk to heads of medical schools on medical ethics issues. Start from thinking, what's that about? And I asked, where are they coming from? Are they looking for the ethics of Confucius? Are they looking for the ethics of Mao? Or are they looking for international best practices? Unquestionably, he said, international best practices. So this idea of the right way to manage X, the economy, the politics, the judicial system, seems to be being internalized, and they seem to want to know, let's call it metaphorically, the McKinsey way. Is that the future for this party, so that it can not change by changing?
Well, I hope, frankly, that's the future for, in this case, the medical profession. In other words, it might be a set of professional ethics rather than something which impinges directly on politics. I'm not an expert on I've been through the Chinese health system, both my kids are born there, but I'm not an expert on the medical profession, but in a general sense, You see it amongst judges, amongst lawyers, amongst journalists, amongst doctors, and frankly, in some ways, amongst the military as well, which are all developing their own professional ethos, their own professional pride, and the sort of the belief in the self-regulating standards like as you have with professional associations in the West. So I would see that more in that part of that phenomenon rather than a political development. I mean, it obviously has political implications because that means they want to run themselves, but it's of a bit of a different nature to political reform in the way that we think about it.
Carl Minsner, Fordham Law School. There's sort of sometimes two competing depictions of how change might take place within the party that are out there. I'll sort of throw both of them out and see if you agree with one or the other. One idea is that there's sort of certain endogenous changes are going to sort of change the party over time. So one thing you'll hear is that, well, that prior generation of leaders, they were all engineers, but the new rising generation, they're all trained in law, and that's going to change things. Or similarly, the new generation, more experience abroad, more training abroad, and that's going to sort of alter the way that the institution behaves and the like. Then the competing, or the other pole, would be that sort of the institution sort of manage the party, organization, departments, and the like, manage to sort of, they can sort of self-replicate themselves going forward. Which one of those do you tend to think that, do you agree with one or the other?
I lean to the latter, if there is a sort of binary division. I mean, it's definitely true that the makeup of the Politburo and the Standing Committee, the educational background is going to change quite radically this time around. I think we had our first lawyers or legally trained people on the Politburo in 2002. But I think the weight of the party organisation, the weight of the party bureaucracy, the power of the general office, so-called, which in all party bodies, the day-to-day management, is a far more powerful force than the fact that somebody went to the Kennedy School for 3 months. Which is not to say that the party won't change, but I think we should expect it to change slowly and in a self-interested, conservative fashion.
Albert Golson, Department of Homeland Security. I just wondered about the issue between the relations currently between China and India. There seems to be a battle over possible resources in that area. There's a new book that came out this month. I haven't read it yet. I believe it's entitled Water, Asia's New Battleground. Considering China and India combined have about 30% of the world's population and only about 10% of the world's fresh water in that area, what sort of dialogue has India and China engaged in with respect to either sharing resources or discussing those sort of issues in that region?
I can't give you an up-to-date readout about this. My general view has been that, and in fact there was a New York Times story to this effect the other day out of India, is that the Indians are obsessed with China, but the Chinese are not obsessed with India. But also, as a Chinese professor told me, that China didn't really respect India till India got the bomb and set it off. But I would be very pessimistic about a really full solution to the territorial dispute. I think the area under question is the size of France or something. Both countries have highly sensitive, edgy, large, nationalistic impulses within the political system, particularly in some respects in India, which seems to be throwing rhetorical bombs at China all the time. The business relationship between the two countries has obviously improved for the better. I also saw a review of that book about water. Who has time to read books these days? If global warming is true, then there will be a fight over that, because frankly China is stuffed. That's where its water comes from. But I'm not up to date on that. So, anyway.
Ron Javers, former executive editor of Newsweek International, and doing a little consulting these days in China and elsewhere.
Robert, please.
I'm sorry, Ron Javers from Newsweek, doing some consulting in China these days. It was an astonishing bit of humility that you produced this evening when you said that you didn't really penetrate the upper hierarchy of the party. No one has, no journalist has, no academic has, of course, so it's a big club we're all in. But I'm just curious, and if you would go so far as to surmise or speculate, I'm curious about the people who revolve around the top, at the tippy top of the party. Curious particularly, to give you an example, of what Wen Jiabao, for example, Grandpa Wen shows up, makes a lovely quotation, the whole country applauds him, and then it's pulled from the China Daily a couple of days later and you can't find it anywhere on the internet. And it's also similar to what's going on strangely in Russia right now with Mr. Putin and Mr. Medvedev. When you think about it, who's really in charge at this point? Maybe this is a problem with communism as it goes into its later stages, I'm not sure. But would you surmise a little bit or give me some of your insight, because I know you spent a lot of time in China, how this mechanics works at the very top, if you would just speculate a little bit, maybe, if you haven't penetrated?
Well, certainly in the PR sense, the Chinese have got much better at this at the top. And this relates to Grandpa Wen. I think in 2006 or 7, when there were large snowstorms around Chinese New Year, literally hundreds of thousands of people were caught down in Guangdong, couldn't get home to see their families. And it was a sort of mini crisis which they managed to get through. But the next time there was a crisis or a natural disaster, big one, was the Sichuan earthquake. And I seem to remember that Wen was on a plane in 3-4 hours. So they clearly had a system set up to respond quickly in a very public way with a top leader to show people that the government cared, quote unquote. On the issue of Wen more broadly, and I have been out of the country for 2 years, the sort of stuff he's been talking about with democracy, he's been saying since about, I think, 2005, 2006. You can interpret it, what does it mean? Is it an all-spin operation? Does he really mean it? And is he speaking more for a more broader constituency, or does he just care about his legacy? The fact that he's kept at it and been slapped down on a number of occasions would suggest the latter in many respects, that he cares about the issue and he cares about his legacy. The more he seems to have spoken about this, it's sort of been paralleled by his declining power. He was always considered a pretty weak economic manager, but maybe unfairly so in comparison with Zhurongji, very different style. As to how it all works at the top, I would love to know. But I think there's this vast machine there that we really have, perhaps very little idea how it really works. I think in my book, frankly, I really just scratched the surface. I think I probably scratched the right surface. I'm convinced of that. But we've got a long way to go before we really get inside how the system works.
But what does it mean that the third person in the party, in the hierarchy, gives a speech and it's not reported? It's kind of... you think of... he's number 3 if he were just actually the premier, one could understand, because the party has control over the media. But he's also number 3 in the party. And what does it mean about kind of dissent within the party?
Well, I thought all this stuff had been reported but maybe taken off later on. So I think that's obviously, if stuff gets pulled off, then there's obviously disagreement about it. It's simple, I think. But who exactly is responsible for pulling it off? Whether it has to go through the head of the propaganda system on the standing committee, who signs off on that sort of thing? I don't know.
You mentioned, or Jonathan, you mentioned
Louder, Patricia.
how the sort of the current group are all engineers by training, and the next generation is going to be different in terms of the leadership. But similarly, if younger people are being recruited who are not only the top students, but who are business people, who are entrepreneurs, and also given the success and just the power of the media and the internet and all of that, how do you think the influx of this generation is going to play a part?
Younger people, or the new leadership generation?
I would imagine it would be less the new leadership generation because they'll be somewhat older, but as these younger members are recruited, people who have been successful entrepreneurs, people who have, also been more active in areas where there's been more freedom, or they're coming out of the top students out of the top universities. I guess it's less the leadership as it is the party members.
So, in some ways it's a very cynical exercise to recruit these people on both sides. Both sides are getting with the strength, as it were. Most of these people, entrepreneurs, are not going to be active party members in any respect, apart from, making gestures here or there, I guess, on a local level, city level, building closer ties with the city leadership. Which is not necessarily healthy. If there was any idealism left in the party, I think that also tends to squeeze it out a little bit more. If it was meant to be a party of the people, I think if you stuff it full of billionaires, then it's less so. From the party's perspective, I think it's good because, or it can be good because they want to colonize every part of the economy and civil society, and the private sector, writ large, is the most powerful force in China, potentially for change, and perhaps the most powerful threat. So it's very important from their perspective to, colonize the private sector. But I don't see how it radically changes the party, except to give it, potentially, not oligarchical tendencies, but it's a way of, channeling funds, if you like. So I don't think it's a great force for change, political change.
I'm Richard Brady's from Russell & Company. After I read Henry Kissinger's book on China, I thought that one of his unspoken assumptions was that the Communist Party has a secure hold on power for stupid people. I looked in the footnotes. There was no reference to any of the writings by respected China experts like Min Pei or Susan Shirk, who have raised questions about the security of the Communist Party. Then we have the Jasmine Spring in the Middle East, and all of a sudden Jasmine disappears from China. If you want to try and send an email to business contacts who have Jasmine in their name, you get very convoluted. Then we have Supergirl fame, in part because somebody thinks that the 400 million watchers who are voting about Supergirl might be persuaded to vote about the leadership of the party in some respect. Is it fair to sense that the Communist Party might be much more concerned about its security and its hold on power than what we in the West may have?
Well, in some respects, they've maintained power and they remain secure in power because they're paranoid. So they can spot a trend. Say, an example of Supergirl, people voting. It's not a good idea for that to spread. The Jasmine Spring was a particular interesting example. I haven't been in China, but it was obviously a very difficult time for a lot of Chinese dissidents. But is there broader discontent in China because of that? Has the economy been thrown off track because of that? No. maybe not for the same reasons as Henry Kissinger, but I'm also in what Andrew Nathan calls the resilient authoritarianism school. I think the party will last as well, and because basically they've got their hands on every lever of power, and if they have to use coercion, they'll do it. They would prefer not to. So I do think, like Dr. Kissinger, they'll be around for the foreseeable future. I should look over here. Sorry, there.
Yeah, Mike Petula with Etsy. Having our firm's name used with Lenin and Marx in the same sentence is surprising, and humbled by someone's question of the reality standard of international best practices. But in a number of these sectors where you have the state-owned companies that you cite, where the nominations and the appointments of chairman, CEO, leadership there is leading to substandard performance. In many of these sectors, you have smaller companies, privately owned, that are all taking share in those markets away from state-owned companies. Does that continue? And if that continues, isn't that ultimately a weakening of the power and influence that comes from the appointments?
Well, if that's the case, yes, I would say so. It does depend. It's what sectors are you talking about?
You could take insurance, you could take banking, or many private entities that are essentially taking share away from the large state.
Yeah, it's the state sector is, in China. I'm not so sure about private banking, apart from sort of the long-standing underground banks, which are real banks in places like Zhejiang and the like. In insurance, I guess there's companies like Ping An, which are sort of private or semi-private. China Life, which is the state company, doesn't behave like a private company, but they're very aggressive in how they conduct their business. So it's not always completely useful to have a pure dichotomy between public and private, because one of the ways they've set the system up is that the state does compete against the state in many areas. Sinopec and PetroChina, for example, have competed vigorously against each other. Same goes for China Unicom, Telecom, China Mobile. They compete against each other. So there's a level of inbuilt competition into the state system. Over time, of course, if these companies are eaten away at, then yes, I think you're right. It diminishes the power of the party because the value of the appointment is less.
I'm afraid we've reached 7 o'clock, even though I see there are lots and lots of hands left. So let me just say, number one, we have books for sale outside, so you may purchase them, and Richard will stay around for a few minutes to autograph them. But the presentation is as great as the book. I highly recommend the book, and if you get it at our slightly discounted price, you can then get Richard's autograph. But thank you so much.